Hi there, my name is Alex Rosens. I'm with Bloomberg Brief, bankruptcy and restructuring newsletter. We're here in Palm Beach today with the architect of Detroit's restructuring, Kevyn, former partner of Jones Day, and also a former FDIC professional.
Yes.
So we're going to get into banks later, but
Right.
Where do you think we are in terms of Detroit's coming back to life? What is the next step for Detroit to come and rejuvenate itself?
Well, I'd like to think the city never really passed in that sense. I mean, it went through a transition, and my tenure as emergency manager was a snapshot in the history of the city, but it was a course correction, a restructuring, if you will, that everybody recognized needed to be done. And it's doing quite nicely now. I mean, in terms of public safety, for instance, made some tremendous gains in a year. Chief Craig, who we hired when we were there from Cincinnati, is doing a wonderful job. Its balance sheet is certainly a lot healthier. We shed about $17 billion in debt off $18 billion balance sheet, and it's cash flow positive. Projections are such that it doesn't have to go to the capital markets if it doesn't want to for the next decade, which is a good thing. So it's not wed to credit like it was before. So it's in a good position. Now, operationally, it still has some things to do with blight and lighting and restructuring the city and planning and zoning and sort of the nuts and bolts of city management. But every city has to do that, and at least now it has the opportunity, the elasticity to go after those goals.
What do you think in terms of the tension between the pensioners and the retirees and the bondholders and the unsecureds? Mm-hmm. That's not just in the Detroit case. You're seeing it in other local governments. And I wonder, how do we resolve that tension? Because we resolved it on one level at Detroit, but we really didn't resolve it. Or what do you think?
Yeah, philosophically, I mean, in Detroit we resolved it. We had a lot of help from the grand bargain that was orchestrated principally by Darren Walker at Ford Foundation and Miriam Nolan at Greater Southeast Michigan Foundation and others to bring in almost $1 billion, $800, and Governor Snyder's contribution, state contribution as well, to preserve the art, under the guise of the mediation. Judge Rosen helped that. So Detroit was a little different. We resolved it with a lot of help. Philosophically, the issue is, in our opinion, the way we approached it in Detroit was, if you're an unsecured creditor, you're an unsecured creditor. And whether you're on the pension side, now you have Detroit and City of Stockton that have ruled that pensions are unsecured claims, despite state law, federal law trumps. And if you're on the financial side, that's the benefit of your bargain. We understand the arguments for UTGOs and LTGOs, first dollars out, priority over and above, but that's not what your instrument said. It doesn't have a security interest, it doesn't have a trap. For instance, for cash flow. So parties of similar ilk sort of need to take a step back and say, hey, how can we work together, because we're in the same boat.
Right.
And we, if we say NIMBY, not in my backyard, that, I want everybody else to take a cut but me,
right,
that's not going to work. That's not fair.
Right.
You're an unsecured creditor, you're treated equally under the doctrine, for instance, of bankruptcy or even receivership law. You're unsecured. So hopefully people take a look at that and say, this is hard. It's difficult. It certainly impacts expectations of oftentimes very vulnerable people, retired people, elderly. It impacts expectations of bondholders who put their clients, who oftentimes are elderly,
right,
as investments.
Well, there's that ugly full circle we have.
That's
because
right.
The pensioners are relying on the same capital
It's
stream.
the same concepts. Okay, whose ox gets gored, who's going to get hurt? Well, the reality is this didn't happen overnight. From a philosophical standpoint, so folks sort of need to take a look at it and say, hey, we need to address this because it's only going to get worse, and that's a worse outcome.
As somebody who was with the FDIC and formerly with the RTC, you probably know the workings of the credit markets probably better than most bankruptcy professionals. Yeah. But in the bond world, when the folks see what happened with Detroit and some of the other local governments, they're probably going to be recalibrating their expectations of what they can get back and what they're going to ask. And so I wonder, do municipal costs go up for cities and local governments? In some ways, you could argue that it accelerates their decline if the credit markets close on them.
Yeah, no, actually, I happen to think most bankruptcy professionals have to be pretty knowledgeable, at least at the corporate level, of financial markets. But most credit grantors, be it municipal credit or other credit, are remarkably rational. They look at the ability of the obligor to pay back the debt. And in Detroit's case, we actually became a better credit risk once we shed some of our debt, right? Because we have positive cash flow. So our rates actually went down. We did 3 offerings while we were in bankruptcy, and got better municipal rates than the city had had in the better part of almost 20 years. That said to me that rational decision making in financial markets can still occur, because at core, a city's an enterprise is supposed to do 5 things really well, right? Public works, public safety and public health, planning, zoning, finance, tax and administration, and parks and recreation. And if you can deliver those services, which is what a municipality does as an enterprise, that's its widget, that's its services, then you're going to attract people to come in. They're going to generate revenue in the form of taxes, excise, use taxes, visitors, conventions, whatever. That's going to make you more credit worthy and have more cash flow, and that's a good thing. What you cannot do is continue to carry an unsustainable debt load into the future forever, because you're not, one, not going to be able to deliver those services. 2, you're not going to be able to pay back the debt anyway.
Right.
So hopefully people, the lesson learned to take away should be, look, let's get an enterprise financially healthy. Doesn't matter whether it's a car company, an airline, a bank holding company. Let's get them financially healthy. Once they're financially healthy, they will grow and thrive, and that's a good thing.
Well, you brought up the return to the credit markets for Detroit.
Right.
Now, do you think that was because people said, oh, the city is the reins are being taken and it's being more responsible with how it spends money or where it's cutting costs? Or was it could you make the argument that here we are, low rate environment, and people need to put money to work, and they're going to jump into muni finance to get that spread over treasuries?
Alex, that's actually a very good point, that it was a propitious time for us, right?
Right.
Because the credit markets are loosening up a little bit, and we didn't plan it. We aren't don't have that much foresight. But I think it's a little bit of both, and that's actually a good point. When you say it like that, the fact that there was high liquidity at the discount window, there's a lot of cash. There's certainly a lot of sovereign wealth flowing around the world in general. So maybe it was the right time as opposed to a time of constriction. But I also like to think that even in that environment, most underwriters and credit grantors aren't reckless. So they want to make prudent financial decisions for their customers. Customers come back, repeat business. So maybe it's a combination of both, that there was some good liquidity out there, but also a function of those folks looking at Detroit and underwriting and saying, you know what, these folks got their financial house in order, they can pay this. That's a good thing.
So it's a combination then?
I'd like to think so.
Okay.
But certainly your point is a very good one, that it was a good time to sort of get back in the market.
Right.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So when we look at the city filed in July of 2013,
Right.
and during the period where throughout the process, did you ever get calls from the White House in any way turning to you saying, we can help if things get slowed down? Was there any point where the administration said, if there's anything we can do to help, and how did that crop up?
Well, I try to stay away from conversations I have with elected officials at municipal, county, state, or federal level. I try to preserve those confidences. I think that's fair. What I think it is fair to say is that the White House convened in November 2013 a summit of over 36 stakeholders, including union partners, grantors, federal grants, and said, look, if you get your house in order, these are the federal programs we can help you with. For instance, the city received over $300 million in federal grants. Some of that money was being held back in 2012 and 2013 because the city was under TA technical administration for its federal grants program, wasn't handling the money right. The real issue with that is there's a 3-year tail on some of that money, that the audit that comes 3 years afterwards, where if you have a repayment obligation, it hits your books 3 years after you spent the money. So what we tried to do was prove to them that we were going to be more prudent and responsible with our administration of grants, that we were going to use it the right way and meet the requirements for both reporting and application, and we did that. And they released, I think, approximately $35 million of 2012 money, and another $36 million of 2013 money after that summit. So they released over $70 million of money that had been awarded but had been held back. And then we put in the city now a grants administrator to centralize grant operations. So the federal government, and this means also the elected officials at the federal level, Debbie Sabinow and others, were very helpful in getting the federal government existing programs available to the city as long as it complied with existing law, and that's what we strove to do, to get much better shape.
that sort of brings up my next question, which is that special panel took place in November of 2013.
Right.
Was that timed to help Detroit, or was that already something that was in the works? To your recollection?
Oh no. Gene Sperling, who was then in OMB, and is from Detroit area, is from Ann Arbor, was the leader of that at that time, and he assigned, along with then Sean Donovan was Secretary of HUD, and Don Graves, who was over at HUD, is now over at the White House, but Don specifically to Detroit with Gina Matrekis to help us revolve that. So that was a targeted effort. After, in 2013, from March, we started to demonstrate that we were going to be a little bit better in how we're going to deal with our grants. And this is all relationships, right? And people's ability to trust what you're going to do. And once we'd like to think, once we demonstrated we're going to be a little bit more sober in how we dealt with our federal money, that the spigot opened a little bit from a concerted effort. That was very helpful.
So it was interesting when we last met in Philadelphia. Right. You mentioned that you had either reached out directly to some of the citizens of the city, or you had to actually toured the city on foot, and you had some impressions that really resonated with you. And that was interesting because that's the difference between parachuting into the courthouse and walking through the city. Do you think that had any resonance to the people that live there in Detroit?
I don't know, but I hope so. What I was trying to do was three things. One, to demystify this is a bean-cutting sort of mercenary coming in to slash and burn the city. I wanted people to get to know me, to meet me, and say that's not how I was raised. That's not who I am. In fact, if you hear that, then let's talk about it. But I want to be engaged. Two, I had a very powerful state statute, 436. But my philosophy under the statute for any receivership is if you're imposing your edicts on a municipality, certain one that was as tender as Detroit was, I didn't really appreciate. When I came in March, Mayor Kilpatrick had just been sentenced to 28 years, so the city had gone through a long period of trauma and disappointment.
Right.
And a lot of residents thought this is going to be another round of disappointment. I wanted to allay those concerns, so I wanted people to understand I was not going to be that kind of person. I wanted to work consensually, and in fact, many of the powers under 436 I never really used because I didn't have to. People started working together. And then finally, the thought I wanted to have was, look, one of the first things I did was restore, under the statute, delegated authority to the mayor and city council to make sure that regular order things would continue. If the city council goes to a conference, a mayor's meeting or something, and sees that there's a provision in another city for 24-hour cameras at an all-night bodega or something, they want to. That's not the type of decision, tactical decision, I should be involved in. That's a lasting decision. So I wanted to make sure that they had that authority going forward, and that the regular order, to the extent we could, would not only be restored but would be respected. So I hope that resonated somewhat with folks. And after a period of time, the entry was a little rough, but after a period of time, I think things settled down.
So away from Detroit specific, the city's Chapter 9, in the last couple of years, most notably Meredith Whitney was saying that this marks the beginning of a wave of Chapter 9 filings. And I wonder, what's your take? I mean, there are restrictions on a state and city level throughout the union as to how you can go about a Chapter 9.
Right.
But do you think we see more of this Chapter 9 activity, or is it more restructurings out of court?
I don't know. I mean, what I'd like, this is going to sound a little odd coming from a bankruptcy practitioner, but I'd like to think that bankruptcy is sort of a last resort as opposed to a first option. I'm always a little careful with using superlatives or predictions, because you never know. Right. So there are other municipalities that may have issues, but they may be able to work it out on some level. So I'm a little cautious of saying what may or may not happen in the Chapter 9 world. What I will say is it's pretty obvious that for a lot of municipalities, I mean, at one point I read a study, there are 250 cities over 100,000 that were on a watch list. That there are a lot of municipalities, and it's not just us. I mean, Greece and Germany are going through the EU issue, with balance of debts. But a lot of systems are under stress, and it seems to me that the best thing to do is to acknowledge that stress, to come up with a plan to deal with it, to work out some consensual concessions that make sense, as opposed to fighting with each other, and to deal with it in a way that you can make it sustainable. Because think of this, Alex, if you do this right, just in the time since 2009. The stock market, when President Obama took office, was what, 7,300?
Right.
18,000.
Right.
That's almost tripling.
Right.
If you had invested in an index stock with your pension funds back in 2008, you almost would have tripled your money. If the Detroit pension funds had invested their money in an appropriate rate, not only could they have paid full pensions on the GRS side, they will on PFRS, but they could have declared a dividend. So the cycles will ebb and flow. Every 7 to 10 years we have recession,
right.
growth, and contraction. But if you manage this prudently and correctly, you will benefit. You just have to get to a nice, even basis going forward.
So we're hearing a lot about Puerto Rico.
Right.
What do you think happens to Puerto Rico? Have you been called on on any level to offer advice to Puerto Rico in terms of how to, first of all, they have to adopt the Chapter 9
right.
or
right.
be allowed to adopt Chapter 9.
Right.
What do you think happens there?
Well, it's probably not proper for me to talk about whether or not folks have reached out to me about Puerto Rico. I'm aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't studied it deeply. I've spent some time on it. I mean, it's complex and it's significant. You have a number of issues having to do with, obviously, public safety. You have issues having to do with net immigration outflow. Puerto Rican citizens, some very highly qualified living. You have debt service, which is significant. You have a decline in businesses. You have concentration of assets and ownership of the means of production. So it's very complex, and I'd like to think that that better minds than mine are focused on it like a laser.
What about Atlantic City? What can you tell us about that? Is that is that shoe-in for Chapter 9?
Nothing's a shoe-in, but first of all, I am not the principal in Atlantic City. Kevyn Lavin is the principal. He's the emergency manager. I'm just a counselor,
okay.
A consultant in Atlantic City, and so it's inappropriate for me to talk about it in that sense. I will say this: Atlantic City, we're going to be open this summer. Come on down, make your conventions, and it has a significant tax base. It does need to address perhaps some of the issues having to deal with the ebb and flow of taxes and appeals, that sort of thing. But Atlantic City is functioning, and the mayor and city council have been very collegial and cooperative so far, so I thank them for that.
So I've walked the streets of Detroit and Atlantic City, and I think there are a lot of parallels to both. One relied heavily on casinos for its tax revenue, the other on the auto industry, and both have seen the decline or change in how both of those businesses are doing. So there are almost parallels in what has brought them to this point.
Well, there are some parallels, but frankly, they're not as significant as you might expect. Atlantic City gets 75% of its tax revenue from casino revenue taxes. Detroit had 4 main drivers. It had income tax, it had real estate taxes, it had state revenue share, and it had casino revenue. It's only 20% compared to almost 80% Atlantic City, so it wasn't quite as dependent on the casino traffic. It had also excise taxes and others. So Detroit's tax base was a little more diverse. Now, the issue of the real estate taxes needing to be normalized, which the mayor did announce he was going to do a few weeks ago, was an issue that's similar. You have tax saturation. You can only tax people so much. Power to tax is the power to destroy, as our founding fathers said. And the other issue is that you had to look at provision of services. Atlantic City actually, in terms of operation and services, does not have some of the issues that Detroit had in terms of response times, EMTs, fires being put out, endemic blight, things along that line. So drill down a little bit more. They may appear very similar, but drill down a little bit more, they're very different. But the underlying issue of both of them is the current state of affairs probably is not sustainable. So it does take some intervention on a receivership basis to correct that. And hopefully that will occur on a consensual basis.
And after your private practice, when you first started practicing law, you got into FDIC and RTC.
Right.
And so I have to ask, how did those experiences there, they're very unique in their own right, but how did that shape a lot of what you did with Detroit, or even if you take on another municipal assignment?
Right. Well, probably helped me develop the zen of emergency management and restructuring. If you're up on the Hill, when I was at RTC, I was in charge of the Whitewater investigation, and I called a subpoena de jure, House minority, House majority, Senate minority, all of them screaming for blood, that the agency was hiding records. You develop a bit of a you know, if you're at the front, you develop sort of a bit of resistance, some callous, and I think that helped me well in Detroit, because certainly there were people who were quite upset. But if you're confident in the course that you're on, you're going to run into a storm.
Right.
Okay, it's going to happen. Can you sail through it? Can you manage it? That's the real question. And if you've done that before at a high level, then it feels a little more comfortable, perhaps, than if you haven't.
So, being able to bring those different constituencies together in Detroit and even down in D.C. in your FDIC and RTC days, any thoughts on politics, going into politics on a state level or a,
Yes, I do have thoughts that I will never do it. I've been pretty well cured. I think I'm better suited in the private sector.
Well, isn't it Mark Twain who said that bring the guy who doesn't want to be a politician and dragging him, screaming to bring him into political office?
Right. Yeah, no, it's probably not my strong suit. I'm more than willing to help elected officials, and certainly in a number of different guises, but thinking that I should be myself elected is probably not where I need to go.
Well, thank you very much for your time.
Sure, thank you very much. It's a pleasure talking again as always.